The little girl had been lying in the freezing rain for 3 hours before anyone noticed. 7 years old, wheelchair overturned, face pressed against the wet concrete of a stranger's porch. No voice to scream with, no way to call for help. 41 people walked past that street that night. Not one of them stopped. It took a dog. A retired military K-9 named Shadow pulled his handler to a dead stop at the edge of the driveway, locked on something in the dark that no human eye had caught yet. And what former Navy SEAL Marcus Hale found in that freezing rain would tear apart everything he thought he knew about what it meant to come home from war. If stories like this move you, subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this one travels. The storm had been building since noon. By the time it hit Evergreen Ridge in full, the kind of cold that had teeth was already settled into the bones of the mountain town. The kind that drove people indoors and kept them there, curtains drawn, heaters running, pretending the world outside didn't exist. Wet snow mixed with freezing rain sheeted against the windows of Marcus Hale's house on the north end of Callaway Street. And Marcus didn't notice because he was on the floor of his living room doing push-ups in the dark. He did that sometimes. Not because he needed the exercise, though 15 years of military conditioning had made the habit feel like breathing, but because the dark and the effort were the only things that turned his brain off. During the day, his mind ran like a motor with no governor. At night, it was worse. So he pushed himself down, drove himself up, counted in his head, and didn't think about Kandahar or Mosul or the smell of diesel and burned flesh that had a way of showing up in his sleep whether he invited it or not. He'd done 400 when Shadow moved. Marcus heard it before he saw it. The soft click of nails on hardwood, then nothing. He paused mid-push-up, lowered himself to the floor, and listened. Shadow was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, 38 kilograms of military-trained working dog who had cleared buildings in 2 active combat zones and once tracked a sniper through 4 kilometers of mountainous terrain in the dark. Shadow didn't make random noise. Shadow didn't pace for no reason. Marcus got up. The dog was at the front door, not barking. That wasn't Shadow's style, but standing rigid with both ears pinned forward and his nose working the gap at the bottom of the door. His tail wasn't moving. His entire body was locked in that posture Marcus had learned to read years ago on FOBs and rooftops when Shadow was telling him something was out there that needed human attention. "What have you got?" Marcus said quietly. Shadow glanced back at him once, then returned to the door. Marcus pulled on his boots without lacing them, grabbed his jacket off the hook, and opened the door. The cold hit him immediately. Wet, mean, the kind that found the seams in your clothes and went straight through. He stepped out onto the porch and looked left, looked right, standard sweep, saw nothing but the orange blur of the streetlight through the rain and the empty white strip of sidewalk disappearing into the dark. Shadow pushed past him and went down the porch steps. "Shadow, here!" The dog didn't come back. He moved along the side of the porch in a tight line, head low, and stopped at the corner of the front steps where the overhang didn't reach. Marcus followed him. What he saw stopped him completely. She was tucked against the base of the porch railing, half hidden by the shadow of the steps, a child so small and so still that he'd walked right past her without seeing her. Her wheelchair had overturned in the slush 3 feet away, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind. She was face up, eyes closed, dressed in a pink jacket that was soaked completely through, her hair plastered flat against her forehead. One hand was stretched out across the wet concrete toward the overturned chair, fingers open, like she'd been reaching for something she couldn't get to. Marcus was on his knees beside her before he knew he'd moved. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse. Thin, too slow, but there. He ran his hands along her limbs, checking for injuries from the fall, found nothing obviously broken. And when he touched the side of her face, she made a sound, barely anything, a small exhale, that told him she was somewhere between conscious and not. "Hey." He kept his voice low and even. "You're okay. I've got you." No response. He got his arms under her, one beneath her knees and one across her back, and lifted her with the same careful precision he'd used lifting casualties out of hot zones. The muscle memory of not causing more damage when you didn't know the full extent of what was already there. She weighed almost nothing. That hit him harder than he expected. Shadow followed them inside without being told. Marcus called 911 while he was getting her onto the couch, keeping the phone wedged between his ear and his shoulder. He gave them the address, described her condition, her approximate age, the wheelchair outside, the temperature she'd been exposed to. The dispatcher's voice had that trained, calm quality that either reassured people or annoyed them depending on how wired they were. Marcus was neither reassured nor annoyed. He was focused. "Is she breathing?" the dispatcher asked. "Shallow but consistent. Pulse is weak. She's been outside in sub-freezing temperature, significant wind chill, wet clothing. I'm estimating exposure time of at least 2 hours based on how cold she is." He was peeling off her wet jacket as he talked, replacing it with the dry blanket from the back of the couch. "She has a wheelchair. I don't know her medical history. Emergency services are 7 minutes out. Keep her warm and keep monitoring her breathing." "Copy." He set the phone down and looked at the child's face. She was young, maybe 6 or 7. Brown hair, pale skin, a scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose. There was a lanyard around her neck attached to a small electronic device. A communication tablet, the kind he'd seen in a VA rehabilitation pamphlet once. The tablet was cracked, screen dark, completely non-functional. Something about that detail hit him in a place he wasn't expecting. She'd had a way to ask for help, and it had been taken away from her when she hit the ground. Shadow lay down beside the couch. Not pressed against her, the dog had better situational awareness than to crowd an injured person. But close enough that when Marcus checked her pulse again and leaned over her, the dog was right there in his peripheral vision, present, steady. Marcus pulled a second blanket from the hallway closet and layered it over the first. He crouched beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, and tried to reconstruct what had happened. The chair had overturned near the porch steps. There were scuff marks in the slush that could have been from the wheels, could have been from her hands trying to right herself. His porch wasn't on the main pedestrian route. This wasn't a kid who'd been passing by. She'd come here specifically, or she'd drifted here in the storm and ended up too exhausted to go any further. He didn't know which. He didn't know anything about her. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes flat. The paramedics were efficient and thorough, and Marcus got out of their way. He answered their questions, found her outside, 3 hours estimated exposure, no ID visible, communication device destroyed, no sign of other people. He watched them stabilize her neck before moving her, watched the practiced shorthand of people who did this in their sleep, and stood in his doorway with Shadow beside him while they loaded her into the back of the ambulance. One of the paramedics, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, paused on the way out. "You know her?" "No." "She just showed up on your porch?" "Shadow found her." The paramedic looked at the dog. "Lucky dog." He left. The ambulance pulled away. The red lights disappeared into the storm. Marcus stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, rain dripping off the porch overhang, Shadow leaning against his left leg with that subtle pressure that the dog used when he thought Marcus needed grounding. "Yeah," Marcus said, to no one. He went back inside and looked at the overturned wheelchair in his front yard. "I went to the hospital." He wasn't sure why. The logical thing was to let the system handle it. Call made, emergency responded to, done. It wasn't her family. He wasn't a doctor. He had no role in whatever came next. But something about the image of her hand stretched out across the wet concrete, reaching for a device that couldn't help her anymore, kept circulating in the back of his head. And after 40 minutes of staring at his kitchen wall, he put Shadow's vest on and drove the 12 blocks to Evergreen Ridge General. The ER waiting area was the usual controlled chaos of a mountain town in winter. Ski injuries, frostbite, 2 separate car accidents from the roads going slick. Marcus signed in at the desk, stated he was the one who'd found the child, and was directed to a row of plastic chairs against the far wall. He sat. Shadow settled at his feet. A nurse came out 20 minutes later. Young woman, scrubs, professional distance that couldn't quite hide the fact that she'd had a hard shift. "You're the man who found her?" "Yes." "She's stable, hypothermia, but we caught it in time. She's going to be okay." A pause. "She has a condition, cerebral palsy. The records show when we pulled her ID from her medical bracelet. She's nonverbal. We've been trying to contact her family." "Any luck?" The nurse's expression shifted, just slightly. "We're working on it." Which meant no. Marcus looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. The storm was still going outside. He could hear it faintly through the building's walls. the structural groan of a mountain town taking weather seriously. He thought about the wheelchair. He thought about the communication device with its cracked screen. Her name, he asked? Ellie. Ellie Carter. Patet. Her name was Ellie Carter. She was 7 years old, and by the time the sun came up the next morning, it had become clear to the hospital's social services coordinator that nobody was coming to claim her. Marcus was still there when the coordinator arrived. Her name was Natalie Brooks, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet competence that came from years of seeing difficult situations and not having the luxury of flinching. She spotted Marcus and Shadow in the waiting area and came over, professional assessment running across her face before she'd taken 3 steps. "You're the one who found her." "Marcus Hale." She sat down across from him. She had a folder. "You've been here all night?" "Most of it." She studied him for a moment without making it obvious she was studying him. "Mr. Hale, I want to be transparent with you. Ellie's situation is complicated. She's been living with extended family, an aunt and her husband, for the past 14 months. Her parents passed away in an accident when she was 5. Marcus said nothing. He waited. Natalie opened the folder, looked at something, closed it. "We've been unable to reach the family since last night. We'll keep trying. But in the meantime," she paused. "Is there anything you can tell me about where or how you found her?" He gave it to her straight. The exact time, the position of the wheelchair, the state of the communication device, the estimated exposure duration. He told her about shadow alerting, about the temperature, about the scuff marks in the slush. He gave it to her the way he used to give after-action reports, factual, sequential, nothing omitted, nothing editorialized. She wrote it down. When he finished, she looked at him. "You're very precise." "Old habit." She nodded slowly, like something had clarified. "Military?" "Navy, 15 years. She glanced at Shadow, at the vest, at Marcus's posture, the way he was seated with his back to a wall in a clear line to both exits, and whatever she'd been deciding about him, she appeared to finish deciding it. "We're going to need to figure out what happened to her, why she was outside in a storm, alone, at that hour." "Any idea yet?" "Nothing confirmed." She stood, smoothing her jacket. "But the medical records we pulled..." Another pause. Longer. "There are some gaps that concern us." She didn't elaborate, and Marcus didn't push, but he'd read enough between lines and enough briefings to know what gaps in a child's medical record usually meant. He drove home, showered, fed Shadow, stood at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the snow. He went back to the hospital that afternoon. He didn't have a reason he could articulate clearly. He told himself it was follow-up, making sure the situation was being handled, the way you checked on a mission parameter after leaving the field. That was the story he used on himself during the drive over, and it held up until he walked into the pediatric ward and found Ellie's room. She was awake. She was sitting up slightly in the hospital bed, small against the pillows, with the kind of stillness that Marcus recognized. Not peace, but hypervigilance. The constant alert state of someone who'd learned that stillness was safer than motion. She was watching the door when he appeared in it, and her eyes went immediately to Shadow. Not to Marcus. To Shadow. The dog was already watching her. His tail did one slow, deliberate wag. Marcus stopped at the doorframe. "Hey." Her eyes tracked back to him, cautious, processing. "I'm the one who found you," he said. "Last night. You were outside my house." He kept his voice the same way he kept it when he was working with Shadow. Flat, calm, no performance in it, because dogs and scared children both knew the difference between real calm and acted calm. "You don't have to do anything. We were in the neighborhood." She looked at Shadow again. He let her look. After a moment, he moved a chair from the corner to a spot near the door, not close to the bed, not looming, and sat down. Shadow positioned himself between Marcus and the bed, equidistant, which was either coincidence or the dog's own social calculation. Marcus had stopped being sure which it was years ago. They sat there for 20 minutes. Marcus didn't try to talk to her. He didn't perform comfort. He just occupied the space, and Shadow occupied it with him, and slowly, so slowly, Marcus almost missed it. The tension in Ellie's shoulders changed. Not gone, but lower. When he stood to leave, she was watching him. Her hand was resting on the edge of the bed, fingers curled around the railing. "We'll come back tomorrow," he said. "If that's okay." She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. The next 2 weeks were a study in things left unsaid. Natalie Brooks called him on day 3. Marcus was in the field behind his house running shadow through tracking drills, the dog working an age scent trail through 6 inches of fresh snow with the focused intensity of an animal who considered this recreation. The family still hasn't responded, Natalie told him. We've made contact now, the aunt, Karen Mercer, and her husband Dale. They know Ellie is in the hospital. Marcus stopped walking. And they said they'd be up when they could. He absorbed that. How far away are they? 40 minutes. He didn't say anything for a moment. Shadow came back to him with the Target article, a piece of worn leather Marcus had used as a training object since Bagram, and dropped it at his feet, looking up with the expectant focus of a dog waiting for the next evolution. That's 40 minutes, Marcus said. Yes, Natalie said. It is. What do the medical records show? A pause. He'd gone slightly past the territory of what she should be telling him, and they both knew it. But she said it anyway, which told him something about where her head was at. Ellie has a care plan that requires specific positioning equipment, daily stretching routines, and regular speech therapy to maximize her use of the communication device. There are records of 3 consecutive missed therapy appointments before she ended up at your house. Her communication device was 6 months overdue for maintenance. Natalie stopped. He heard her breathe. Her last recorded wait was 13 months ago, Mr. Hale. Marcus looked across the snow-covered field. I'll be at the hospital this afternoon, he said. I know, she said, like she'd been counting on it. He brought Shadow every day. The dog was the bridge. That was the only way Marcus could think of it. Ellie didn't trust people, at least not quickly, but she'd been reading Shadow since the first afternoon, and Shadow had been reading her right back. And whatever communication passed between a Belgian Malinois with a combat history and a 7-year-old girl who'd never had a reliable person in her life, it was apparently sufficient. On day 5, she let the dog put his head in her lap. On day 7, she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the side of his neck and held it there for a full minute with her eyes closed. On day 9, she looked at Marcus directly for the first time. It lasted about 3 seconds. But it was direct. Not wary surveillance, actual eye contact, the kind where she was choosing to let him see her looking. He didn't react to it. He just looked back for those 3 seconds, nodded once, and returned his attention to the window, keeping it low-key, not making her regret it. A nurse caught him in the hallway on day 11. Not Natalie. A different one, older, with reading glasses pushed up on her head. You're not family, she said. Statement, not question. No. You're here every day. Yes. She studied him. She lights up when you walk in with that dog. He wasn't sure what to say to that. I'm just telling you, the nurse said, and walked away. On day 13, Natalie met him in the parking lot before he got inside. Her expression told him something had changed. The Mercers are coming in, she said. Today. They're claiming they want her back. Marcus stopped walking. Natalie's face was doing something careful. There's going to be a child welfare review. They have a right to be heard. They're family. But given what we've documented, the caseworker assigned to Ellie has concerns. She paused. Strong ones. What happens in the meantime? Ellie needs to be discharged. Physically, she's ready. But she can't go back to the Mercers while the review is open. Not with the documentation we have. She hesitated. We're trying to identify a foster placement, someone with experience in complex care needs. How long will that take? For someone with Ellie's level of need? She held his gaze. Could be weeks. Most placements. She stopped. Started over. Most people aren't prepared for what she needs. He stood there in the parking lot with the cold coming off the asphalt, and Shadow sitting at his left heel, ears forward, watching Natalie with the patient attention of a dog who was following the conversation better than most people would believe. Marcus looked at the hospital entrance. He thought about the field behind his house, the empty rooms, the quiet that had been fine before, and now, for the first time in a long time, felt like something different than peace. He thought about her hand against Shadow's neck, fingers spread, eyes closed. What does the certification process look like, he said, for emergency temporary guardianship? Natalie's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. I'll get you the forms, she said. He had the paperwork started by 4 o'clock. He was at his kitchen table filling out the third page when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost let it go, then picked up. Is this Marcus Hale? A man's voice. Heavy, flat, the kind of flat that wasn't natural calm but forced calm. This is Dale Mercer, Ellie's uncle. Marcus set down his pen. I heard you've been visiting her, Dale continued. Every day. That's right. I appreciate someone looking out for her. The voice was doing something, testing texture, feeling for something, the way a hand moves along a surface looking for where the edge is. But I want you to know, we're coming to pick her up tomorrow. She's family. She belongs with us. Marcus looked at the form in front of him. I hear you, he said. So you understand. We don't need any outside involvement in our family matter. A pause. Outside, the wind moved through the pines behind the house, that low, hollow sound that evergreen ridge made in winter when the air came off the mountain. She was face down in freezing rain, Marcus said, outside a stranger's house, alone, at 10:30 at night. The silence on the other end lasted 2 seconds. 3. Kids have accidents, Dale Mercer said. Marcus said nothing. Mr. Hale. The forced calm was doing something different now, pressurizing, the way a voice does when someone is used to that being enough. I strongly suggest you stay out of matters that don't concern you. Marcus looked at the form again. Third page, Section 4. Emergency Temporary Guardianship Petition, basis for application. I'll see you at the review, he said, and ended the call. He picked up his pen. Shadow walked over from across the kitchen and lay down beside his chair, pressing the full length of his body against Marcus's leg. Marcus kept writing. He was halfway through page 4 when his front doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. It was past 7, dark outside, temperature dropping again, the kind of night that kept people in. He pushed back from the table and went to the door, Shadow coming with him, and opened it. Standing on his porch were 2 people he'd never seen before. The man was large, 50s, with the posture of someone who'd spent a long time being the biggest person in most rooms. The woman beside him was thinner, arms crossed over herself despite the heavy coat, eyes that moved fast and didn't settle. Marcus Hale? The man said. Behind them, in the driveway, Marcus could see a truck he didn't recognize. And in the passenger window of that truck, barely visible in the darkness, a face he did recognize, small, pale, brown hair. Ellie. His entire chest went cold. What is Ellie doing in that vehicle? Marcus said, and it was not a question. Dale Mercer filled the doorframe the way certain men do, not just with size, but with the assumption that size was sufficient. He had a working man's hands and a soft man's eyes, the kind of eyes that had spent years watching other people decide whether to push back or let it go. He'd learned early which way most people went. She discharged herself, Dale said. Family came to get her, that's how it works. Marcus didn't move from the doorway. She's 7 years old. She doesn't discharge herself. The hospital released her to family care. Dale's voice had that same pressurized quality from the phone call. Not loud, but leaning, like a thumb on a scale. Which is us. So. The woman beside him, Karen, the aunt, hadn't spoken yet. She was watching Marcus with a specific kind of wariness. The kind that came from being near someone unpredictable for long enough that you started reading everybody that way. Her arms were still crossed. She'd positioned herself slightly behind Dale's right shoulder without seeming to notice she'd done it. Marcus looked past them at the truck. Ellie was still in the passenger window. In the dark, it was hard to read her expression, but her face was angled toward the porch, toward the light. And something about the angle of it, chin up, not pressed away, told him she was watching. Step inside, Marcus said. Dale blinked. Excuse me? It's cold. Come inside. He stepped back from the door, making space, keeping his voice level. Or stay on the porch. But we're going to talk. Dale looked at him for a moment, recalibrating. Men like Dale were used to 2 responses, compliance or open confrontation. Marcus was giving him neither, and that seemed to require a moment to process. He came inside. Karen followed. Shadow moved to Marcus's left and sat, watching them with the impartial attention of a dog who had been trained to read body language and was currently reading plenty. Marcus closed the door. The kitchen table still had the guardianship paperwork spread across it, 4 pages, pen resting in the crease of page 3. Dale's eyes went to it, went back to Marcus. "What is that?" Dale said. "Paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" "The kind I'm allowed to file." Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down across from them, not offering them seats, keeping it just slightly asymmetrical, the kind of thing that was technically nothing but landed differently in the room. "The hospital didn't release Ellie to you. Not through proper channels. There's an open welfare review on her case. Who told you it was okay to remove her from the ward?" "She's our family," Karen said. First words from her. Her voice was flat in a specific way. Not tough, just exhausted. The voice of someone who'd been having a version of this conversation for a long time. You have the right to be heard in the review process," Marcus said. "That's different from picking her up from a hospital in the middle of the night while a welfare case is open." He looked at Dale. "I'm going to ask you to bring her back inside. She can stay here tonight while the process gets sorted out properly tomorrow morning." Dale's jaw shifted. "You've got a lot of nerve." "She was outside in sub-freezing rain for 3 hours," Marcus said, "while she was living with you. I found her, so yeah, I've got some nerve." The room went quiet except for the wind outside and Shadow's quiet breathing. Dale took a step forward. It wasn't a lunge, more of a shift, a recalibration of distance, the kind men do when they want to establish that the space between two people can be closed at will. Marcus didn't move, didn't adjust his posture. He just sat there and looked at Dale Mercer with the particular blankness of someone who had stood in rooms with people far more dangerous than Dale Mercer and had not found those people especially interesting. Something in that blankness landed. Dale stopped moving. "She needs her equipment," Karen said quietly. Her voice had changed. The flat exhaustion was still there, but something else had moved under it. "Her chair. The positioning." "I'll get what she needs," Marcus said. "Tonight, if you tell me where it is. Tomorrow morning first thing, I'll call Natalie Brooks at Child Services and we'll sort out the formal arrangement. But Ellie's not going anywhere in a truck at 8 o'clock at night." Another silence. Dale looked at his wife. Karen looked at the table. The paperwork was visible between them. 4 pages of intent, sitting right there, not hidden, not apologized for. "This isn't over," Dale said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It isn't." He got Ellie out of the truck himself. Dale had her small travel wheelchair, a lighter version, foldable, different from the one that was still in Marcus's front yard, in the truck bed. He unloaded it without looking at Marcus. Karen stayed by the passenger door while Marcus went around to Ellie's side and opened it. She was buckled in, still wearing her hospital bracelet, a thin blanket around her shoulders that was doing essentially nothing against the cold. She looked at him. That same 3-second eye contact from the hospital, except this time it held longer. "Hey," he said, "you're coming inside." She looked at the house, at the porch light, at Shadow, who had come down the porch steps and was waiting at the end of the driveway with his ears forward. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, nothing that broad, but a change. Like a room where someone opened a window. He unbuckled her carefully, lifted her, and carried her to the chair that Dale had set up on the driveway. He settled her in it, checked that she was stable, and then stood back and let her roll herself toward the porch. She got herself up the ramp he'd had installed. He'd put it in that afternoon before coming back from the hospital, a basic aluminum ramp he'd ordered same-day delivery, with the focused economy of someone who had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for her. Shadow walked beside her the whole way. Marcus stood in the driveway and watched Dale Mercer's truck until the taillights disappeared. The guest room on this ground floor had been a storage room for the better part of 2 years. Marcus had cleared it out that morning, which had involved moving 3 boxes of equipment manuals, a duffel bag of old gear, and a set of weights he kept telling himself he'd put in the garage, and put in the spare bed and a lamp. It wasn't much. The walls were bare, the floor was plain hardwood, and the window needed a curtain that he didn't have. Ellie sat in her chair in the middle of the room and looked around it. Marcus stood in the doorway. "It's not much. I can get better stuff." She didn't respond, but her eyes moved across the room methodically, the same way his did when he entered an unfamiliar space, which he noticed but didn't say anything about. "You need anything before I leave you to it?" She looked at him, then down at her lap. Then she made a gesture, her hand opening and closing twice in a specific way, fingers together, palm facing inward. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't pretend he did. I don't know that one yet. I'll learn. He kept his voice the same. No apology in it, no overcompensation, just a statement. Shadow can stay in here tonight if you want him. His choice too, so. He looked at the dog. Shadow was already positioned beside Ellie's chair, nose at her knee. Looks like he's already decided. He left the door cracked 4 inches, went to the kitchen, and called Natalie Brooks's emergency line. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. The Mercers took her from the hospital, Marcus said. I know. I got the call 40 minutes ago. He heard movement, papers, the specific background texture of someone working late. Marcus, technically the duty nurse signed off on a family release because their paperwork looked in order. There's going to be a review of that separately. But what matters right now? She's here, at my house. A pause. The Mercers agreed to that? Natalie asked carefully. They didn't have a lot of negotiating room. Another pause. He could hear her processing the implications of that. I'm going to need you to have her back here first thing tomorrow, 7:30. I'll have the emergency temporary guardianship order ready to file the moment the office opens. Given what happened tonight, it strengthens our position significantly. What happened to the welfare review? It's still open. Nothing about tonight changes that. If anything, removing her from the hospital during an active review is going to be a problem for the Mercers when this goes to formal evaluation. She paused again. How is she? He looked down the hallway at the cracked door, a thin stripe of lamplight across the floor. Shadow's shadow, unmoving. She's okay, he said. What? He slept 3 hours. Not because anything was wrong. Ellie didn't make noise. Shadow didn't alert. The house was quiet in the way it usually was at 3 a.m. But Marcus's brain had downshifted into a mode he recognized from deployments. The light sleep state where you're technically resting, but some part of you is still running monitoring cycles, cataloging sounds, tracking patterns. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the Mercer case in the methodical way he used to think through mission parameters. What he had: a child removed from consistent medical care, documented missed appointments, a broken communication device 6 months overdue for maintenance, a last recorded wait from 13 months ago. What he didn't have: proof of what had specifically put Ellie outside in a storm. That gap was the problem. The Mercers could argue accident, confusion, any number of things. The welfare review would rely on pattern, not incident. Patterns took time to establish in court. Time was the variable he couldn't control. He got up at 5, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window watching the dark start to gray at the edges. Shadow came out of the guest room at 5:15, did a circuit of the ground floor, came to the kitchen and sat beside Marcus at the window. The dog had done this for years, found wherever Marcus was and anchored himself there. On FOBs in Afghanistan, in barracks in Virginia, in this kitchen in a mountain town where the snow on the ground was blue-gray before sunrise. Good night? Marcus asked. Shadow wagged once, slow. Me too. Ellie was awake when he checked on her at 6. Sitting up in the bed, she'd managed to get from the chair to the bed herself at some point, which told him something about her range of motion and her determination, with the hospital blanket pulled to her waist and her eyes open, watching the window. The window faced the backyard. Through it, in the early gray light, the pines behind the house were visible, dark shapes against a sky going pale. It had snowed 2 more inches overnight. Everything was covered. She was watching it with an expression Marcus recognized. It was the expression of someone who'd been inside for a long time. He knocked on the doorframe. She turned. You need to use the bathroom. There's one through that door, he indicated. If you need me to... He stopped. He didn't know what she needed. He needed to learn. Just knock on the wall if you need something. I'll be in the kitchen. He made oatmeal. He made it plain because he didn't know her preferences, then put brown sugar and cinnamon on the side separately so she could choose. He poured juice, set it on the low section of the counter where she could reach it from the chair. She came out of the guest room at 6:40, chair navigating the hallway with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it since she was small. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the food, looked at him. I don't know what you like, Marcus said, so I kept it simple. You can add what you want. She rolled to the counter, looked at the brown sugar, looked at the cinnamon, added both in careful amounts, with the focused deliberateness of someone who had learned to do things herself because waiting for help was slower and less reliable. She ate. He drank his coffee. Shadow lay between them on the kitchen floor. It was not comfortable exactly. He wasn't going to call it comfortable. That would be dishonest. But it wasn't strained either. It was two people in a kitchen in the early morning negotiating a shared space without a script. When she finished, she looked at him. She made a gesture, different from the one last night. Both hands this time, a motion he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. "Still learning," he said. "Sorry." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of the blanket she'd draped over her lap. He hadn't noticed it until now, and pulled out a small notebook. A spiral-bound pocket notebook, the cheap kind, with a stubby pencil tucked in the wire. She opened it to a blank page and wrote something and turned it toward him. "Thank you for the food." Her handwriting was unsteady, the motor control challenges that came with her condition, but it was legible, and she held it out steadily enough. Marcus looked at it. "You're welcome," he said. Just that. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. Then she turned her chair toward the window over the kitchen sink, the one that faced the side yard, and sat there looking at the snow until it was time to go. Natalie Brooks was waiting outside the Child Services office when Marcus pulled up at 7:25. She had 2 cups of coffee from the place down the street, handed one to Marcus without preamble, and crouched briefly beside the passenger door to look at Ellie in the back seat. "Hi, Ellie. I'm Natalie. We've talked a little. I'm one of the people helping figure out what comes next for you." She kept her voice measured, not high-pitched, not performatively gentle, just direct, like she was talking to someone capable of following what she said. "We're going to go inside and there's going to be some paperwork and some talking. You don't have to do anything. You can just be here, okay?" Ellie looked at her, nodded once, small but definite. Natalie straightened and walked beside Marcus toward the building entrance. She spoke quietly without looking at him. "The Mercers called our office this morning." "When?" 7. They're contesting the emergency guardianship filing. Their attorney, they already have one, which tells you something, is arguing that you have no legal standing and that last night constituted interference in a family matter. Marcus held the door open for Ellie's chair to clear. "What's our position?" "Our position is that Ellie was found outside in sub-freezing conditions during an active storm, suffering from hypothermia, alone, at night. That her medical care plan had been significantly neglected over the preceding months, and that the Mercer family removed her from a hospital during an active welfare review, which is," she paused to nod at the receptionist, "which is going to require some explaining on their part." "Is the emergency order going through?" "My supervisor signed off at 7:15. Your temporary emergency guardian effective this morning, pending the full hearing which is scheduled." She checked her watch. 14 days. 14 days. Marcus thought about what a motivated attorney with a flexible relationship to the truth could do with 14 days and kept his expression neutral. The office they settled in was small and government issue. Fluorescent lighting, a round table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard on the wall with nothing written on it. Natalie spread the paperwork. Marcus sat beside Ellie's chair. Shadow positioned himself at the base of the table, calm, a brown and black anchor. Ellie's eyes went around the room once, then settled on the whiteboard. It was blank. Just a plain white rectangle. She watched it for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus and made a gesture, one hand pointing toward the whiteboard, then curling her fingers together like she was holding something. He didn't know that one either. "Natalie," he said, "is there a marker?" The 14 days moved away. 14 days move when you're waiting for something, uneven, slower, in the middle than the beginning or the end. Marcus built routine because routine was what he knew how to build, and because Ellie, he realized pretty quickly, responded to routine the way some people responded to quiet music. It organized something in her. When she knew what was coming, her body was different, less braced. Mornings, oatmeal, then the side yard if the weather allowed. Shadow running the perimeter while Ellie watched from the porch in a heavy blanket Marcus had found at the army surplus in town. He'd also found a proper outdoor wheelchair cushion, better positioned for cold weather, and a headrest attachment the chair had been missing. He'd sourced the part number from the manufacturer and ordered it same day, the way he'd once sourced equipment parts in-country with worse logistics and higher stakes. He was learning her communication. Not fast. He wasn't going to pretend he was fast at it, but deliberately. He'd found a reference guide for basic ASL and the specific symbol-based system Ellie's communication device used, downloaded it, printed it, pinned it to the kitchen wall. He went through it every night after she was asleep. He made mistakes daily, misread gestures, had to ask her to repeat herself, said "I don't know that one yet" more times in 2 weeks than he'd said it in his entire military career. She seemed, gradually, to find this acceptable. Not funny. She wasn't there yet, but acceptable. He got the communication device to a repair center in Denver. They turned it around in 4 days. When it came back, she held it in her lap for a long time before she turned it on, like she was checking whether to trust it. He didn't rush her. The Mercer's attorney, a man named Pruitt, whom Marcus had not yet met in person, but whose paperwork he had read 3 times, was building a case around the argument that Marcus was an unqualified single man with a military history and no parenting experience, that emergency guardianship had been improperly expedited, and that the Mercer family had a biological claim in a stable home environment. The neglect documentation that Natalie had assembled was being characterized in Pruitt's filings as administrative oversights and scheduling difficulties. Marcus read those filings the way he'd read intelligence reports, looking for the assumptions embedded in the language, the things that weren't being said, the structural weaknesses. There were weaknesses. He started documenting everything, not obsessively, not in a way that consumed the house, but systematically. Every therapy session Ellie attended, time-stamped. Every improvement in her condition, noted with clinical specificity. The way she was eating, more, consistently, which her doctors at a follow-up appointment noted immediately. The new positioning equipment he'd arranged with her physical therapist. The communication device maintenance log, now current and ongoing. He kept it all in a folder that lived in the kitchen drawer, updated it every 2 days. Natalie called it overkill. He told her he'd seen what happened when paperwork wasn't done right. She didn't argue. Ellie drew. He hadn't known that about her until he found her sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon with the spiral notebook, filling a page with something, head bent close, pencil moving in the careful, deliberate strokes of someone working around the physical difficulty of it. He came in from the backyard, had been working shadow through obedience drills to keep the dog's certification current, and stopped when he saw her. She didn't look up. He got water from the fridge, leaned against the counter, and didn't say anything. Didn't make it a moment. Shadow came in behind him, shook the snow from his coat, and went and lay down near Ellie's chair without disturbing her. When she finished, she looked at what she'd drawn for a moment. Then she turned the notebook around and pushed it across the table toward him. It was rough. The pencil lines were uneven, the proportions slightly off. But it was recognizable. A dog and a man on a porch in the rain. The dog was sitting. The man was crouching. Between them, on the ground, was a small figure. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. "That's pretty good," he said. She pulled the notebook back, looked at the drawing, made a gesture he'd learned by now. Both hands at chest height, palms up, a questioning openness. "Is it okay?" He'd looked that one up twice to be sure he had it right. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." She turned the notebook back to her side of the table, but she didn't close it. The day before the hearing, Pruitt filed a supplemental motion. Marcus read it at the kitchen table at 9 p.m., Ellie already in the guest room, Shadow in the doorway between them. The motion argued that Marcus Hale's military record included a service-related psychological evaluation from 2019, a mandatory evaluation following a combat incident, standard procedure, the kind that every operator went through, and that this evaluation should be considered in the court's assessment of his suitability as a guardian. The implication was clear enough. They weren't saying he was unstable, they were just making sure the judge had the idea in the room. He set the filing down. He thought about the 2019 evaluation. He knew exactly what was in it. He'd read the report himself, which some people didn't do. It showed a man processing a difficult event through appropriate channels, showing no clinical indicators of ongoing impairment, cleared for full duty within 6 weeks. Standard. Clean, by operational standards. But Pruitt wasn't trying to win on facts. He was trying to win on the weight of suggestion, on the image of a former soldier with a psych eval, sitting across from a stable family unit with a biological connection. Marcus picked up his phone and called Natalie. "I saw it," she said. She sounded like she'd been awake for a while. "How bad is it?" Honestly, it's a tactic. A court that's seen custody cases isn't going to weight a mandatory service eval the way a jury without context might. But she paused. Our judge, Carolyn Voss. I looked her up. She's been on family court for 9 years. She's seen this move before. That helps or hurts. Depends on whether she's annoyed by it or just unmoved. He absorbed that. What's our strongest position tomorrow? Ellie's improvement, documented, medical, undeniable. And another pause. What Ellie communicates, if she communicates anything. He looked down the hallway at the cracked door. The lamp was still on in the guest room. She slept with it on, low, a detail he'd noted on the first night and not commented on. She'll be there, he said. Marcus. Natalie's voice shifted. Still professional, but something below it. Whatever happens tomorrow. What you've done in the last 14 days, that's not nothing. Whatever the court decides, that's not nothing. He looked at the filing on the table. Get some sleep, he said, and ended the call. He stayed at the table for another hour. Not reviewing documents, he'd read everything there was to read. Just sitting in the quiet of the house, listening to the sounds of it. The heater cycling, the wind off the mountain, lighter tonight than it had been in weeks. Something in the walls, the way houses settle when the temperature drops. He'd lived in this house for 3 years without learning what it sounded like at 9:30 on a weeknight when there was a light on in the guest room. He hadn't known it sounded like this. Shadow came over from the doorway and put his head on Marcus's knee. Heavy, deliberate. Yeah, Marcus said. I know. He went to bed. In the morning, they went to court. The Mercer's attorney was already in the hallway when they arrived, and the look on Prewitt's face when Marcus walked through the courthouse doors, not alone, not rattled, Shadow at his left heel, and Ellie in her chair, and Natalie Brooks 2 steps behind with a folder that was thick enough to slow a door, was the look of a man recalculating. Marcus had seen that look before. He found it about as encouraging as he ever had. Prewitt was a compact man in an expensive suit who moved through spaces like he'd already measured them. He had the particular confidence of someone who had won enough times to stop imagining losing, and when he saw Marcus come through the courthouse doors, he did the thing that men like him did. Took inventory, assigned a category, moved on. Marcus had been assigned categories his whole life. He was used to it. The hearing room was smaller than he'd expected. Not a full courtroom. A family court chamber, wood paneling, a raised bench, 2 tables facing each other with a clear lane between. A window on the left wall let in the flat winter light of a Colorado morning that couldn't decide whether to commit to sunlight or not. A court reporter sat at her station. A bailiff by the door. Judge Carolyn Voss's chair was empty. Marcus settled Ellie's chair at the table beside Natalie. Shadow went under the table without being told, disappearing from view except for the slow wag of his tail against the floor leg of Marcus's chair. Ellie had her communication device in her lap, powered on, the screen casting a faint light against her jacket. She'd turned it on herself that morning without prompting, which was the first time she'd done that unprompted since it came back from the repair center. He hadn't said anything about it, just noticed. Prewitt was at the opposite table with Dale and Karen Mercer. Dale was in a shirt and tie that looked recently purchased, the collar sitting slightly wrong on his neck. Karen had her hands folded on the table and was looking at a fixed point somewhere above and between the tables, the expression of someone managing something from the inside. Prewitt leaned over and said something to Dale. Dale nodded without really listening. Marcus looked at the judge's bench and waited. Judge Carolyn Voss came in at 8:53. She was in her mid-50s, gray at the temples, and she moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this long enough that the room adjusted to her rather than the other way around. She had reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck and a folder that she set on the bench and didn't immediately open. She looked at both tables, took a moment. This is a review of emergency temporary guardianship granted to Marcus Hale for Ellie Carter, 7 years old, pending full custody determination, she said. The voice was clear and level, no performance in it, which Marcus appreciated. We have a supplemental motion filed yesterday evening by Mr. Prewitt on behalf of the Mercer family. I've read it. She set her glasses on, opened the folder. Mr. Prewitt, you filed that motion at 9:47 p.m. the night before this hearing. Walk me through your reasoning. Prewitt stood. He was polished at standing, the way he arranged himself, hands at a specific angle, weight balanced. Your Honor, The motion concerns documentation that only became available to us late yesterday, and which we believe materially relevant to the court's assessment of Mr. Hale's suitability. The 2019 psychological evaluation. Yes, Your Honor. Which was a mandatory post-incident evaluation. A beat. That's our understanding, yes. Conducted after a combat deployment. Cleared for full duty within, she checked the folder, 6 weeks. The evaluation itself notes, Mr. Pruitt. She looked at him over her glasses. Not hostile, just complete. I've been on this bench for 9 years. I know what a mandatory service eval looks like, and I know what filing it the night before a hearing looks like. Is there anything in that document that shows a finding of clinical impairment? Not a formal finding, no, but then I'll be giving it the weight it merits. She looked back at the folder. Let's proceed. Pruitt sat down. His expression didn't change, but something in it settled into a different configuration. Natalie touched Marcus's arm briefly under the table. Not a squeeze, just a contact, barely a second. He kept his eyes forward. The first hour was documentation. Natalie presented Ellie's medical timeline with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd been building the case for 2 weeks. 3 consecutive missed physical therapy appointments. 6 months without communication device maintenance. The repair center's assessment was in the record, noting wear patterns consistent with extended absence of standard servicing. The gap in weight records. The positioning equipment that had been improperly adjusted for over a year, contributing to secondary complications that our current physical therapist had identified and begun addressing in the 14 days since Marcus had taken guardianship. The physical therapist's name was Dr. Anita Cho, and she testified by video link, which the court had arranged. She was young, precise, and direct. She described Ellie's condition on first assessment: secondary contracture development from incorrect positioning, pressure points indicating extended periods in a chair that wasn't properly fitted, malnourishment markers that didn't emerge overnight. In your professional opinion, Natalie said, how long would these conditions have been developing? The contracture indicators suggest at minimum 8 to 12 months of inconsistent proper positioning. The nutritional markers are harder to pinpoint without prior baseline weight data, which, Dr. Cho paused, which I was unable to locate in her records from the prior 14 months. Because there wasn't any, Natalie said. There was no recorded weight in the provided records from the 14 months of the Mercer guardianship, no. Pruitt cross-examined with the efficiency of someone who knew the testimony was damaging and needed to minimize, not eliminate. He got Dr. Cho to acknowledge that some of the conditions could have developed partially prior to the Mercer guardianship, which was technically true and also incomplete. He did it smoothly. Judge Voss wrote something down. Dale Mercer testified mid-morning. He'd been coached. That was visible in the way he sat and the cadence of his opening answers, measured, careful, the opposite of his natural register. He described Ellie's care in terms of their best efforts, the challenges of managing a child with complex needs alongside work schedules, the difficulty of getting appointments in a mountain town. Mr. Mercer, Pruitt said, can you describe your home environment and the resources you've made available for Ellie? We've got a house with a first-floor bedroom, a ramp we put in when she came to stay. Karen, my wife, took a part-time schedule to be home more. We love Ellie. She's family. And the night of December 14th, the night she was found outside. That was... Dale shifted. That was an accident. She got out while Karen was... We'd had a long day. We don't know exactly how it happened. That's the truth. You don't know how a 7-year-old in a wheelchair came to be outside alone in sub-freezing conditions at 10:30 at night, Natalie said on cross. I told you, it was... You were home that evening? A beat. We were... Karen and I were both... He stopped. We'd had a long week. We may have fallen asleep. Both of you. It happens. With a child in the house who relies on you for everything, Pruitt objected on form. The judge allowed the question. Mr. Mercer, Natalie said, Ellie was outside for an estimated 3 hours. Based on her condition when she was found, medical staff estimated a minimum of 2.5 hours of exposure in a temperature of 17 degrees with significant wind chill. You were asleep for 2.5 hours without checking on a 7-year-old with a complex care plan. I said it was an accident. His voice had lost the coached quality. The flat, pressurized thing was coming back. We're not perfect, Nobody's perfect. Nobody's asking for perfect, Mr. Mercer. Natalie set a document on the table between them. This is the care plan filed with Ellie's medical team at the time she was placed with you. Can you tell me the frequency of required physical therapy sessions? He looked at the document. It says twice weekly. And in the 14 months she was with you, how many sessions did she attend? Silence. Mr. Mercer. I'd have to check the records. I have the records. Natalie set another document beside the first. 11. In 14 months. The care plan requires a minimum of 112. The room was quiet. Judge Voss was writing. Marcus watched Dale's face across the chamber. The man wasn't stupid. Marcus had never thought he was stupid. He was just someone who had constructed a version of reality that required not looking too carefully at certain things, and now he was in a room where other people were looking. Prewitt's counterplay came after lunch. Marcus had known something was coming from the way Prewitt had been quiet through the morning session. Not defeated quiet, assembling quiet. He called a witness Marcus hadn't seen in the room before. A woman named Sheila Garrett, 60s, reading glasses, the manner of a professional who testified regularly. She was a licensed family counselor. Prewitt had apparently retained her for an assessment. Ms. Garrett, Prewitt said, you conducted an assessment of Mr. Hale's suitability for guardianship? I conducted an evaluation based on documentation and a 45-minute interview with Mr. Hale. Yes. And your findings? Mr. Hale presents as a capable and organized individual. However, she settled back. I have concerns about the capacity of a single individual, particularly one with no prior parenting experience and a recent significant career transition, to manage the long-term demands of a child with complex care needs. The demands of Ellie's condition will increase, not decrease, over time. Additionally, the military to civilian transition period, which Mr. Hale is still navigating by his own account, presents its own psychological demands that may conflict. May conflict, Marcus said. Prewitt looked at him. The judge looked at him. Sorry, Marcus said. I'll wait. Flat on the table in front of him. He got the message. Prewitt had Garrett continue for another 6 minutes. She was careful. Nothing specific enough to be directly refutable. Everything framed as concern and potential. The language of maybe and might and could present challenges. Professional enough to know the line between assessment and accusation. Natalie cross-examined. Ms. Garrett, how long was your interview with Mr. Hale? Approximately 45 minutes. And how long has Mr. Hale been Ellie's temporary guardian? 14 days, I understand. In those 14 days, how many did you observe directly? A small pause. The assessment was document and interview based, so 0. I reviewed documentation, and how many pounds has Ellie gained in the 14 days since entering Mr. Hale's guardianship? Garrett didn't have that number. Natalie did. 4.2 pounds. She put it in the record. How many physical therapy sessions has Ellie attended in 14 days? I don't have that specific. 6. The care plan requires 2 per week. He's met the schedule completely. Natalie set the therapy logs on the table. How many times has the communication device been properly serviced under Mr. Hale's guardianship? Once. It's now current and fully functional. Another document. Ms. Garrett, your concerns about Mr. Hale's capacity are theoretical. The documentation covers 14 days of actual practice. I'd like the court to weigh those against each other. Judge Voss looked at Natalie, then at Marcus. Then she made a note. Garrett was dismissed. The afternoon session was when Prewitt shifted the terrain. He'd been watching Ellie since morning. Marcus had noticed the way a man with a plan watches the variable he's decided to work with. It wasn't predatory exactly. It was tactical. And when Prewitt stood and addressed the judge at 2:15, Marcus understood what the morning had been building toward. Your Honor, we request that the court conduct a brief direct observation of Ellie's responses and preferences. The child is 7 years old and has been with Mr. Hale for 2 weeks. Before that, she was with the Mercer family for 14 months. We believe the court would benefit from observing her interaction with both parties without, with respect, the influence of a courtroom dynamic being heavily managed by one side. You want to put a 7-year-old with cerebral palsy through a preference assessment in a courtroom, Natalie said. I want the court to see an authentic interaction, not testimony, not documentation. The child herself. Judge Voss looked at Natalie, at Marcus, at Ellie. Ellie was looking at her communication device screen. Ms. Brooks, the judge said. Mr. Hale. Objections? Natalie started to speak. Marcus put his hand on her arm. She looked at him. He looked at the judge. No objection. Natalie's expression moved toward something she was actively suppressing. All right, Judge Voss said. We'll take a 15-minute recess and then conduct a brief observation. Mr. Pruitt, this is an observation, not an examination. No one is going to interrogate a 7-year-old. I'll be watching how she responds in the room with both parties present. That's it. Understood, Your Honor. During the recess, Natalie pulled Marcus to the corner of the chamber while the Mercers stepped out. What are you doing? She said. It wasn't a question. I know what I'm doing. You're gambling on what Ellie does in a room with people who've had her for 14 months. And us for 2 weeks. He looked at her. She can handle it. You can't know that. No, he said, but I know her. Natalie held his gaze for a moment. She was smart enough to hear the difference between confidence and denial, and she was working out which this was. If this goes wrong, she said, if it goes wrong, we're no worse than we were before he filed the motion. He looked toward the table where Ellie was sitting, device in her lap. She's been trying to say something in there all day. Let her say it. Oh. The observation setup was simple. Judge Voss had the chairs rearranged, both families on the same side of the room, no tables between anyone, a more neutral configuration. She remained at the bench but had moved her chair to one side, making herself less the center of the space. The court reporter stayed. The bailiff moved to the back. Dale and Karen sat to the left. Marcus sat to the right. Natalie was at the back. Shadow stayed beside Marcus's chair. Ellie was in the middle. Judge Voss addressed her directly and simply. Ellie, no one needs you to do anything right now. We're just going to be in the room together for a little while. Is that okay? Ellie looked at her, nodded. The first few minutes were quiet. Dale Mercer tried first. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and used a voice that Marcus recognized. The coached voice from the stand, gentle, measured. Hey, Elle, how are you doing? You feeling okay? Ellie looked at him. Her expression was specific, not hostile, not frightened, but specific in the way a face gets when a person is receiving information they've already processed. She looked at him for 4 seconds and then looked at her device. Karen said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was watching Ellie with something that was harder to read. Not calculation, but not ease either. There was something real in Karen's face that hadn't been in Dale's testimony, and Marcus filed it without using it. Shadow had not moved from Marcus's left. After a moment, Ellie turned her chair. It was a small movement, not dramatic, not performed. She just turned it, the way you turn toward a window when the light changes. She turned it toward Marcus's side of the room. Pruitt's jaw shifted. Marcus kept his face neutral. He looked at Ellie and waited. She was working her device. The familiar focused deliberateness, eyes tracking the screen, one hand navigating, the other steadying. She'd been getting faster with it. He'd watched it over 2 weeks, the way fluency builds, how it starts to look less like operating equipment and more like speaking. She looked up at him. Then she turned the device's speaker toward the room and pressed the output button. The synthesized voice was clear in the quiet chamber. It was the standard voice the device used. Not her voice, not yet, maybe never in the traditional sense, but the vehicle her words traveled in. I feel safe with Marcus. The room absorbed it. Not stunned silence. It wasn't a movie. It was the particular silence of a room where something has been said that requires a moment to sit before anyone decides what to do with it. Judge Voss's pen had stopped moving. The court reporter's fingers were still. Pruitt was looking at the floor. Dale Mercer was looking at his wife. Karen was looking at Ellie, and on Karen's face was something that had moved past the point of being controlled, something that Marcus looked at once and then looked away from because it was private. Ellie looked at her screen for a moment. Then she looked at Shadow. Shadow's tail moved, twice. She reached down and pressed her palm flat against the side of his neck, the way she'd done in the hospital, eyes closing briefly. Then she opened them and looked at the judge. Judge Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then she made a note. Pruitt asked for a continuation. Your Honor, given what we've observed, We'd like additional time to prepare a supplemental position. You've had 14 days, Mr. Pruitt, the same amount of time as everyone else. Judge Voss closed her folder. I'll have my ruling this afternoon. We'll reconvene at 4. The chamber cleared slowly. Marcus stayed at the table while Natalie spoke quietly to the court clerk, reviewing something about procedural timelines. Ellie had turned her chair toward the window on the left wall, the one with the flat winter light. She was looking at the parking lot, or at the mountains past it, or at something else entirely. Dale Mercer stopped in the doorway on the way out. Not a threatening stop. He'd lost whatever that posture was built on, somewhere around 11 a.m. when the therapy logs went into the record. He just stood there, looking at Ellie's back. He didn't say anything. He left. Marcus looked at the window where Ellie was sitting. Her hands were in her lap. One of them was resting on Shadow's head. The dog had moved without being called, just positioned himself there, and now he was looking at the same window she was looking at, both of them quiet in the thin afternoon light. Marcus thought about the night he'd found her. He'd been on the floor of his living room doing push-ups in the dark, running his brain down the way you drain a battery, and a dog had walked to the front door and stood there like something needed looking at. And Marcus had followed, because that's what you did. You followed the alert. You went toward the thing that needed seeing. He hadn't known what it was going to be. You never did. They found a coffee machine in the courthouse lobby, and Marcus got 2 cups, brought one back to the chamber, set it on the table near Ellie in case she wanted it. She didn't. She looked at it, looked at him, gestured toward her water bottle, which was her way of saying she was fine. He drank his coffee. Natalie sat beside him. She did something extraordinary in there, she said quietly. She said what she thought. In a courtroom, at 7 years old, with a communication device and people she doesn't know watching every move she makes. Natalie turned her cup in her hands. I've been doing this for 8 years. I have never... She stopped herself. I'm just saying, don't underestimate what that cost her. He looked at Ellie. She'd taken the spiral notebook from her jacket pocket. She carried it everywhere now, which he'd noticed around day 5. And she was drawing, bent over the page, pencil moving carefully. He didn't try to see what it was. At 3:48, she turned the notebook around and put it on the table, pushing it toward him. He picked it up. She'd drawn the courtroom, basic lines, rough proportions. 2 tables, a window, a dog under a table. 2 people sitting together at one table. And at the center of the page, a small figure in a wheelchair with a device in her lap. Around the figure, in the careful, uneven handwriting he'd been reading for 2 weeks, she'd written one word. Home. Marcus set the notebook down. He'd spent 3 years in that house on Calloway Street doing nothing with the quiet. He'd told himself it was peace. He'd told himself the solitude was what he needed after what the job had taken. He'd built routine and maintained it and called it recovery, and never examined too closely whether what he was recovering toward was something he actually wanted to get to. He looked at the notebook on the table. He wasn't going to get emotional about it. That wasn't how he was built, and he wasn't going to perform something for the benefit of anyone watching. But he sat with it, really sat with it, the word in her handwriting, the rough lines of a room that had been the hardest room he'd been in years. And he let himself know what it meant. Then he picked up the notebook and handed it back to her. Keep that one, he said. She looked at him. The drawing's good, he said. She looked at the notebook. Then she looked at him again and held eye contact for longer than 3 seconds, longer than she ever had, longer than Marcus had counted on. And he looked back and neither of them made it more than it was. The bailiff appeared at the chamber door at 3:58. Judge Voss is ready. The ruling took 11 minutes to deliver. Judge Voss was thorough because she was always thorough, because courts that moved fast through child welfare decisions created problems for themselves downstream, and because she'd been in family court long enough to know that the cases that felt simple were often the ones that came back later. She addressed the documentation. She addressed the testimony. She addressed the supplemental motion about the psychological evaluation, and in 2 sentences explained why it had been given minimal weight. Then she addressed the observation period. The court observed Ellie Carter in a neutral setting with both parties present. The child has a diagnosed condition affecting communication and motor function. She nonetheless communicated her experience and her preferences with clarity that this court found both credible and significant. A pause. Courts are cautious about placing undue weight on a child's stated preference, particularly at this age, in these circumstances. At the same time, the court is not in the business of treating a child's clearly communicated experience as irrelevant. She looked at both tables. The emergency temporary guardianship granted to Marcus Hale is extended pending full custody hearing, which I'm scheduling for 60 days out. Mr. Hale will maintain guardianship during this period. A formal home evaluation will be conducted within the next 3 weeks. Dr. Cho and Ellie's therapy team will continue to provide progress documentation to the court. She looked at the Mercer table. The Mercer family will have supervised visitation rights to be arranged through the social work office during the pending period. I want to be clear. Supervised means exactly what it says. She closed the folder. Ellie stays with Mr. Hale. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Marcus sat very still for a moment. Natalie let out a breath beside him that she'd apparently been holding for the last 20 minutes. She gathered her documents with the efficient speed of someone who wanted to get out of the room before something changed, which was a habit Marcus understood. Prewitt was speaking to Dale in a low voice. Dale was nodding. Karen was not nodding. Karen was sitting very still, looking at the table, and her expression had gone somewhere past what the day required, and Marcus didn't look at it for long. He turned to Ellie. She was looking at him. Device in her lap, notebook back in her pocket, hands resting open on her knees in the posture she had when she was waiting to find out what came next. "We're going home," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not a burst of relief, not a performance, just a shift. A slight easing, like a held breath released so slowly you almost missed it. She put her hands on her wheels. Shadow was already moving toward the door. Outside, the winter light had finally decided. Late afternoon gold was cutting through the cloud cover, hard and clear, the way mountain light gets in January when it shows up at all. It lit the courthouse steps in long angles, made the snow on the sidewalk look almost warm. Marcus got the ramp positioned for Ellie's chair. She came down it herself, took the sidewalk at her own pace. Shadow walked beside her without being asked, matching her speed exactly, the way he'd matched Marcus's pace on 1,000 different terrains. Natalie stopped on the steps behind them. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Home evaluation scheduling, the next steps for the 60-day hearing?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "Marcus." She waited until he looked at her. "You did good." He looked at Ellie at the bottom of the courthouse steps, stopped in the low winter sunlight, looking up at the mountains that ringed the town. Shadow beside her, both of them still. "She did," he said. He went down the steps to where she was. The drive home from the courthouse took 12 minutes. Marcus knew the route well enough that he didn't have to think about it, which meant he was thinking about other things. The 60-day timeline, the home evaluation, the therapy documentation schedule, the specific language Judge Voss had used about supervised visitation, and what the enforcement mechanism looked like if the Mercers tested the boundaries of that. His brain had downshifted into planning mode, the same gear it used after a mission when there was still work to do and the adrenaline was clearing but hadn't cleared completely. Ellie was in the back seat, which she preferred. She liked the window, liked being able to see the mountains from that angle. Shadow was beside her, which was technically against Marcus's original rule about the dog and upholstered furniture, but which had become pointless to enforce around day 4. She was drawing in the notebook. He could see her in the rear view, bent over the page, pencil moving, the familiar focused tilt of her head. He didn't ask what she was drawing. He'd learned not to ask. She'd show him, or she wouldn't. When they pulled onto Callaway Street and he parked in the driveway, she stayed in the back seat for a moment after he opened the door, not ready yet, looking at the house. He stood beside the door and let her look. The house looked the way it always looked. Plain, square, the aluminum ramp he'd installed on the front steps, the porch light on because he'd started leaving it on during the day as a matter of habit. She'd drawn it once. Just the porch, just the light. He'd found it tucked under her pillow during a laundry change and put it back without saying anything. She came out of the car herself, transferred to her chair, with the practiced efficiency that still surprised him. Not because it shouldn't have been there, but because efficiency like that was built from necessity, and necessity meant a long time without enough help. She went up the ramp. He followed. Inside, Shadow went immediately to his water bowl. The house smelled like the soup Marcus had left in the slow cooker that morning. Something practical, easy to eat. He'd started cooking more in the last 2 weeks, not because he enjoyed it, but because it was a variable he could control. Ellie stopped in the middle of the living room. She turned her chair around and looked at him. She held up the notebook, open to the last page she'd been drawing on. It was the courtroom again, but different from the earlier one. This time there was more detail. The window, the dog under the table, the judge's bench, and at the center the small figure in the chair with a speech bubble coming from the device in her lap. Inside the speech bubble, in her careful handwriting, "I feel safe with Marcus." She'd drawn it again, the things she'd said, put it in the picture. He looked at it for a moment. "That's going on the wall," he said. She looked at him. A beat. Then she closed the notebook and went to the kitchen for dinner. The home evaluation was scheduled for day 9 of the 60-day period. The evaluator was a man named Gordon Reese, contracted through the county, who drove up from the lower valley in a Subaru with a cracked taillight and a canvas bag full of clipboards. He was in his late 40s, methodical, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had assessed enough homes that he'd stopped having first impressions. He walked through every room. He measured doorway clearances, checked the bathroom adaptations Marcus had installed, grab bars, the adjustable shower seat, the lowered mirror that had required some drilling, tested the ramp grade, examined the positioning equipment in Ellie's room, looked at the communication device charging station, and the printed reference guides pinned to the kitchen wall. He didn't say much during the walkthrough. Marcus didn't fill the silence. In the kitchen, Reese stopped at the wall where Marcus had pinned the ASL reference guide, the communication symbol chart, and a 2-page therapy schedule with checkboxes. He looked at it for a long moment. "You made this yourself?" he said. Downloaded the references. Built the schedule with Dr. Cho. "When?" "First week." Reese wrote something down, turned a page on his clipboard. "Mr. Hale, I need to ask you some direct questions. Not about the house. About you." "Go ahead." "Why are you doing this?" Marcus looked at him. "Doing what?" "This." Reese gestured, a small, inclusive motion that took in the room, the charts, the ramp, the entire 14-day architecture of a life reshaped. "You have no legal obligation to this child. You found her. You called emergency services. By any standard, your responsibility ended there. Why does it not end there for you?" Marcus thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because someone had to stay," he said. Reese wrote it down. Verbatim, it looked like. "Do you think you're equipped for this long term?" "No," Marcus said. Reese looked up. "I'm equipped for the next week," Marcus said. "I learn what I need for the week after that. That's how I've done everything." He paused. "She's been here 2 weeks and she's gained 4 pounds and she goes to therapy twice a week, and her device works. I can't tell you what I'll be equipped for in 5 years. I can tell you what I'm doing now." Reese studied him for a moment. Then he wrote something else down, flipped his clipboard to a new page, and went to find Ellie. Ellie's portion of the evaluation happened in the living room. Reese sat across from her with no clipboard visible. He'd set it on the table behind him, which Marcus noticed and thought was a decent instinct. He spoke to her the same way Judge Voss had, directly and without the particular condescension that some adults applied to kids who communicated differently, like the absence of speech indicated an absence of comprehension. Marcus stayed in the kitchen. He could hear Reese's questions, low, measured, and the synthesized voice of Ellie's device responding. He didn't try to track the content. That wasn't his business. But he listened to the rhythm of it, the back and forth, and after about 20 minutes he heard something he hadn't heard before from that room. A sound. Not words. Not the device. A sound from Ellie herself. A short, exhaled note that landed somewhere between a syllable and a laugh, small and unguarded, gone almost before it registered. He didn't react. He kept his eyes on the counter in front of him. Reese came back to the kitchen 15 minutes later. "She showed me her drawings," he said. "She show you all of them?" "There were a lot." He picked up his clipboard. "She's been drawing this house, repeatedly." Marcus didn't say anything. "Mr. Hale." Reese clicked his pen twice. "My report will take a week, but I want to be honest with you. I've done over 200 of these evaluations. I've walked through houses that looked like show homes and filed concerns. I've walked through houses that needed work and filed clean reports." He looked around the kitchen, the charts on the wall, the adapted counter height Marcus had arranged by temporarily installing a pull-out surface at Ellie's level, the slow cooker still running. "This isn't a show home, but it's a real one. He left. Marcus stood in the kitchen. Shadow came over and sat on his foot. Just sat on it, the full weight of a 38-kilogram dog, which was Shadow's version of a gesture he didn't have words for. Yeah, Marcus said. The Mercer situation didn't resolve quietly. Marcus hadn't expected it to. People rarely went from a courtroom loss to acceptance in a straight line, especially when the loss was structured in a way that required them to acknowledge something about themselves. The Mercers' first supervised visitation was scheduled for day 11. They canceled it day of, through Prewitt's office, no explanation given. The second, day 18, they attended. Natalie had arranged the visitation at the social services building, neutral space, a family room with a table and chairs, and a basket of activities in the corner that had the slightly worn quality of things handled by many different children. She was present as the supervising worker. Marcus dropped Ellie off and left, because that was the arrangement, and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 90 minutes because he wasn't ready to go further than that yet, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Ellie came out looking the way she usually looked, contained, reading as neutral to anyone who didn't know her well enough to see the difference between her neutral and her actual neutral. Marcus had learned the difference around day 6. On the drive home, she took out her notebook and wrote something and handed it to him at a red light. Karen cried. He read it, handed it back. Okay, he said. She put the notebook away, looked out the window at the mountain through the glass. He drove. He thought about Karen Mercer's face in the courtroom, the thing he'd looked away from because it was private. He wasn't going to construct a judgment he didn't have enough information for. What he knew was the documentation. What he knew was what a 7-year-old looked like after 14 months of insufficient care. What happened inside the Mercer house, the specific texture of how it had gone wrong, whether it was indifference or overwhelm or something else entirely. He didn't know, and he was careful about the things he didn't know. But Karen had cried. He held that information without doing much with it. On day 22, Prewitt filed again. The new motion was more sophisticated than the psychological evaluation angle. Marcus would give him that. It focused on permanency. The argument was structural. Ellie needed long-term stability, and a single individual with no established family support network, however capable in the short term, could not provide the same permanency guarantee as a biological family unit. The motion requested a court-appointed guardian ad litem, a separate attorney for Ellie, and a formal assessment of long-term placement options, including licensed foster families with experience in complex care. Natalie called him the morning it was filed. It's not frivolous, she said. The guardian ad litem request especially. Courts take those seriously. Get one, Marcus said. A pause. You're not concerned? If Ellie has someone in that courtroom whose only job is to represent her interests, that's not a threat to me. He was in the backyard, running Shadow through scent tracking in the new snow. Schedule it. The long-term placement argument is the one we need to address. How? Marcus, the court is going to want to know what your plan looks like beyond 60 days. They're going to want to know what your support network is, whether you've thought about what happens if you're incapacitated, what Ellie's situation looks like in 5 years, 10 years, when her care needs evolve. I've thought about it. And? He threw the tracking article into the tree line and watched Shadow disappear into the pines after it. I've been talking to a woman from the Cerebral Palsy Support Network in Denver, Carla Reyes. She connects families with resources, helps with care planning, knows the system. I've got a meeting with her next week. Silence. You didn't mention that, Natalie said. I'm mentioning it now. Is there more you haven't mentioned? He thought about it. I reached out to a former teammate, Tom Vega. He's in Fort Collins, 40 minutes south. He said if anything happens to me, he'd want to be involved. His wife is a pediatric occupational therapist. Another silence. Longer. You built a support network, Natalie said. I built the beginning of one. It's not complete. I know it's not complete. Shadow came back out of the pines with the article, dropped it, waited. Marcus retrieved it. But it exists, and I can document it. He heard Natalie exhale slowly. Okay. I need all of that in writing before the next hearing. It will be. Marcus. She paused. You're not making this easy to argue against, you know that. Good, he said, and let Shadow run. The guardian ad litem. The court appointed was a woman named Deborah Finch. She was 60, retired attorney, had been doing guardian ad litem work for 12 years, and she showed up at Marcus's house on day 26 at 9 in the morning with the unannounced directness of someone who found scheduled visits less informative than the alternative. She hadn't called ahead. She'd called Natalie, who told Marcus the night before to expect an unannounced visit sometime in the next week, and had looked slightly apologetic about not being more specific. Marcus opened the door at her knock. She was standing on the porch in a heavy coat and wool cap, looking at the ramp with an expression that was taking notes without writing anything down. "Mr. Hale, Deborah Finch." "I know. Come in." She came in. She did the same thing Reese had done, moved through the house with methodical attention, but where Reese had been focused on physical setup, Finch was focused on something harder to measure. She looked at the drawings on the walls. Marcus had made good on his word about the courtroom drawing, and it was up on the living room wall in a frame he'd bought from the hardware store. Slightly too large for the paper, but it was what they had. Finch stood in front of it for a full 30 seconds. "She drew this," Finch said. "Yes." "Here." In the car, on the way home from the first hearing. Finch turned and looked at him. She had the specific gaze of someone who had interviewed enough people to have a calibrated sense of when they were being managed and when they weren't. "I'll need to spend time with Ellie separately," she said. "Today, if that works." "She's in her room. I'll ask her." He knocked on the guest room door. It was still the guest room, technically, though Ellie had started calling it something else in her device. A word Marcus had looked up and found meant my room in the symbol system she used, which he had not commented on, but had noted. She came to the door, looked at Finch in the hallway, looked at Marcus. "This is Deborah Finch," Marcus said. "She's been assigned by the court to represent you specifically. Her job is to make sure whatever happens is what's actually best for you, separate from what anybody else wants." He kept his voice even. "She wants to talk with you. You don't have to, but she's on your side." Ellie looked at Finch for a long moment. Then she opened her door wider. Marcus stepped back and went to the kitchen. Oh, they were in there for an hour and 40 minutes. He made coffee, drank it. Made a second cup, didn't drink it. Worked through some of the documentation he'd been assembling for the hearing. The Carla Reyes meeting notes, the email exchange with Tom Vega, the updated therapy logs. The work was real, but he was also doing it because sitting still wasn't something he was good at. Shadow lay by the kitchen door, head on his paws, facing the hallway. At 11:15, Finch came out alone. She sat down across from Marcus at the kitchen table without being invited, which told him something about her. She set a small notebook on the table, not open, just placed there. "Mr. Hale, I want to be direct with you. Please. I've done this work for 12 years. I've represented children in situations that range from straightforward to devastating. In cases like Ellie's, where a child has both a disability and a history of inadequate care, the most common outcome is a licensed foster placement with a family that has existing certification and infrastructure. That's not the worst outcome, but it's also not the only good one." She looked at the table, then at him. "Ellie told me she wants to stay here. That's not unusual. Children often express preference for the most recent placement, especially in the short term. But she also told me—" Finch stopped, seemed to be choosing how to proceed. "She described her time with you in specific terms, not vague. She described daily routines, specific interactions, the dog. She described the night you found her. She drew it for me." She opened her notebook and turned it toward him. A pencil sketch on a plain page. A porch in the rain. A dog. A man crouching. Between them, on the ground, a small figure. He'd seen that drawing before. Not this copy, Ellie's own version. But this one, drawn during their conversation, was nearly identical. "She's been drawing that night repeatedly," Finch said. "I know. Do you know why?" He thought about it honestly. "I think it's the first time someone found her," he said. Finch looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook and closed it. "I'm going to recommend to the court that the guardianship proceed toward permanency review," she said. "That's not a guarantee of outcome, but I want to be clear. The Mercers are still contesting. The court has its own process, but my recommendation carries weight, and I want you to know where it's going." He nodded. "I'll need your full support network documentation before the hearing." She stood. "And Mr. Hale." She looked at the drawing on the living room wall. visible from where they were sitting. The ramp, the charts, the device maintenance log, that's all good. But you didn't have to frame the drawing. He looked at it. No, he said, I didn't. She picked up her coat. That's why I'm writing the recommendation I'm writing. She went to the door. I'll be in touch. She left. Marcus sat at the table for a moment. Then he got up, went to the hallway, and knocked on Ellie's door. You okay? A pause. Then the door opened. She looked at him. She had her device in her hand, not in her lap, held, which meant she had something to say. She navigated to an output and held the device toward him. The voice spoke. She asked me what I want. What'd you tell her? She navigated again. I told her the truth. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door, giving her the space, the way he'd learned to do. Okay, he said. Dinner's at 6. I'm making the soup again. She made a gesture, both hands together, a quick motion he'd learned around day 9. It meant good, or okay, or sometimes thank you, depending on the context. He went back to the kitchen. The full custody hearing was day 61. 1 day past the deadline, because Judge Voss had a scheduling conflict that her clerk apologized for in writing, and Marcus had not spent any energy being bothered by. 1 day was nothing. He'd waited longer than 1 day for worse things. The night before, he couldn't sleep again. He was in the kitchen at 2 a.m., same as the first night, same chair, different thoughts. The documentation folder was on the table in front of him. Not because he was reviewing it, he'd reviewed everything there was to review, but because having it there gave his hand something to be near. He heard the door, Ellie's door, the soft sound of her chair in the hallway. He didn't move, didn't want to startle her or make her feel like she needed to explain being awake. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was in the oversized sweatshirt she'd started wearing over her pajamas, the one she'd picked out herself at the store on day 20, when he'd taken her for what she needed, and she'd spent 12 minutes examining the sweatshirt rack with the serious attention of someone making a significant decision. She looked at him, looked at the table, looked at the folder. She rolled to the table and sat across from him. Shadow came out of her room behind her and settled between their chairs. They sat there in the quiet kitchen at 2 in the morning, the three of them, not saying anything, which was its own kind of conversation. He made tea. He'd bought herbal tea on day 8 when he'd noticed she watched him make coffee with a kind of focused attention that he eventually identified as wanting some, and set it at her spot on the counter within reach. She got it herself. He went back to his chair. After a while, she took out the notebook. I expected a drawing. Instead, she wrote something and slid it across the table. Are you scared? He looked at the question. He thought about the honest answer, which was different from the convenient one. Yeah, he said, a little. She wrote again, slid it back. Me too. He read it, nodded. That's probably the right amount, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the notebook back to her side and started drawing. He didn't ask what. He sat with his coffee and watched the clock on the wall and let the quiet do what it did, which was less nothing than it used to be. At 3:15, she went back to her room. At 3:17, he heard her door close. He stayed at the table until 5, then went and got dressed. The courtroom felt different on day 61. Same chamber, same wood paneling, same flat light from the same window. But the configuration had changed. Deborah Finch was present now, seated separately with her own materials, which altered the geometry of the room in a way that was subtle and significant. The Mercers were at their table. Prewitt had a new suit. Dale's tie was the same wrong-cut one from the first hearing. Karen looked different. Marcus noticed it when she came in. She was thinner, or it was the coat, or it was something else. She sat beside Dale, and she didn't look at the Mercer table as much as she looked at the room in general, the way people do when they've stopped being sure where to look. Judge Voss came in at 8:57. She opened her folder. She looked at both tables. She looked at Finch. We're here for final custody determination in the matter of Ellie Carter, she said. I've received the Guardian ad litem report, the updated home evaluation from Mr. Reese, the therapy documentation and medical records from Dr. Cho's office, and the support network documentation filed by Mr. Hale. She turned a page. I've also received a letter. Marcus looked up. A letter submitted to the court by Karen Mercer, the judge continued. Not through counsel, directly, which Mr. Prewitt will perhaps want to note for future reference in terms of process. but the court has received and reviewed it. She looked at Karen. Karen was looking at the table. Prewitt had the expression of a man who had just learned something he hadn't known, which confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Karen had done it without telling him. "The letter is part of the record," Judge Voss said. "I'm not going to read it into the record in full because it contains personal material that I believe the author intended to remain with the court. But I will say that it is a document of considerable honesty and that it has informed my thinking in ways that documentary evidence alone would not." She took her glasses off. Ellie Carter is 7 years old. She has a condition that will require accommodation, support, and advocacy for the rest of her life. The question before this court is, who provides that, and in what structure? She looked at both tables evenly. This court has reviewed the history of the prior placement, the documented deficits, the circumstances of the night of December 14th, and the 61-day record of the temporary guardianship. The court has also heard from Ellie herself through the guardian ad litem process and the direct observation conducted at the first hearing. She opened the folder. The court finds that Marcus Hale has demonstrated, in 61 days, which is not a long time, a standard of care that exceeds the documented baseline of the prior placement by a significant and measurable margin. The court further finds that the support network presented is genuine, documented, and structurally sound for immediate needs with a credible path toward expansion. She turned a page. The court also takes note of the guardian ad litem recommendation. She looked at Finch. Finch nodded once. Permanent guardianship is granted to Marcus Hale, effective today, with quarterly review for the first 2 years and annual review thereafter. She paused. The Mercer family, specifically Karen Mercer, may petition for regulated visitation after a 90-day period, subject to social work evaluation. The court will consider those petitions based on the specific history and what serves Ellie's welfare. She closed the folder. This is a final order. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The room moved the way rooms moved after decisions. The exhale, the shuffling, the immediate gear shift from tension to logistics. Natalie was writing something. Finch was closing her notebook. Prewitt was speaking to Dale in a quiet, final statement voice. Marcus sat still. He heard the synthesized voice before he'd fully registered that Ellie had been navigating her device. The sound came from beside him, low and clear in the settling room. "Thank you, Marcus." He looked at her. She was looking at her screen, not at him. But her shoulders were different. Her whole body was different in the chair. Something that had been braced and held and carried quietly for a long time had shifted, maybe slightly, maybe more than slightly, in a way that wouldn't be visible to anyone who hadn't spent 61 days learning what her baseline looked like. He put his hand on the armrest of her chair. Not on her hand, just the armrest near. The way Shadow sometimes positioned himself, present, not pressing. "You're welcome," he said. Across the room, Karen Mercer stood. She looked at Ellie. She held that for a moment, not reaching for her, not moving, just looking. And then she looked away and walked toward the door, and Dale followed her, and Prewitt gathered his papers, and the chamber cleared. Natalie appeared at Marcus's shoulder. "I need about 20 minutes with the clerk for paperwork. Then we're done." She looked at Ellie. "Congratulations, Ellie." Ellie looked at her and made the gesture Marcus had learned on day 9. Natalie looked at him. "What does that mean?" "Thank you," he said. She smiled, a real one, the kind that didn't show up often in her professional register, and went to find the clerk. Marcus looked at the window. The winter light was flat and gray today, no gold in it, the mountains invisible behind a low-cloud ceiling. The courtroom felt smaller with most people gone from it. He sat in that small room in the flat light and thought about a stormy night in December, a dog at a door, a child on a frozen porch. He thought about what Finch had said. The first time someone found her. Shadow's tail moved against his leg, slow, deliberate. The three of them sat there in the quiet room, waiting for the paperwork to clear, and the world outside kept its weather. And it didn't matter. The paperwork took 23 minutes. Marcus sat at the table while Natalie handled the clerk, and Ellie drew in her notebook, and Shadow slept with his chin on Marcus's boot. The courtroom had emptied completely by then. Even the bailiff had stepped out, leaving the three of them in the kind of institutional quiet that only exists in public buildings after the public has left. Fluorescent hum. The distant sound of a door somewhere down the hall. When Natalie came back, she set a copy of the order on the table in front of Marcus. Official header, Judge Voss's signature, a case number he'd have memorized by the end of the week, whether he tried to or not. "That's yours," she said. "Keep it somewhere you can find it." He looked at it, folded it once, put it in his jacket pocket. "What happens now?" he said. "Not anxious, just procedural. The next mission parameter. Quarterly check-in with the court. I'll be your contact point for the first year, then the case transitions to standard monitoring." She sat down, not because there was more business, but because she wasn't quite ready to call it done either. The Mercer visitation petition. If Karen files after 90 days, we'll go through evaluation. It's not automatic approval, but given what she submitted to the court, I think we can work with it. What did she submit? Natalie looked at him. You don't know? Judge said it was personal. It was. She paused. She wrote about what happened the night of December 14th, the real version. Dale had fallen asleep on the couch. He does that, apparently, most evenings. Karen had taken medication for a migraine and gone to bed early. She woke up at midnight and Ellie was gone and she... Natalie stopped, gathered the thought. She drove around for 2 hours looking before she found out Ellie was at the hospital. She didn't come forward because Dale told her not to. She's been carrying that for 2 months. Marcus looked at the table. She also wrote about the care plan, Natalie continued. The missed appointments. She said she knew it wasn't right. She said Dale handled everything administrative and she let him because it was easier and she knew it was wrong and she let it be easier anyway. A pause. She didn't write it to get visitation. She wrote it because she said Ellie deserved the truth to be somewhere official. He sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of a person admitting something they didn't have to admit. He knew what that cost. He'd written a few of those things himself over the years. After-action reports, where the honest version was harder than the version that protected everyone's record. Okay, he said. Natalie stood. Good. She picked up her folder, straightened her coat. Marcus, for what it's worth. She looked at him and then at Ellie, who was still drawing, head bent, pencil moving. I've been in this work for 8 years. I've seen a lot of kids in situations like hers. Most of the time the story doesn't turn at the courthouse. It turns somewhere smaller, some moment that nobody writes down. She looked back at him. For her, I think it turned in a driveway in the dark. She left. Marcus got up and went to the window. Outside, the parking lot was half empty, the mountains still hidden behind cloud. He stood there and let the quiet sit. Hey, he turned toward Ellie. You ready to go home? She looked up from the notebook. She held it toward him. One last drawing, the last page. It was the 3 of them. Outside the courthouse. The dog, the man, the girl in the chair. Behind them, barely outlined, the mountains. Above them, the same flat winter sky. But she'd drawn the sun coming through. Not dramatically, just a break in the clouds. A single angle of light hitting the steps. He took the notebook, looked at it. Good, he said. He handed it back. Let's go. All right. The drive home was quiet in the way that had become their way. Not silence as absence, but silence as a thing they'd negotiated, the 3 of them, over 61 days of mornings and evenings, and the specific mundane hours of a shared life. Shadow had claimed the back seat beside Ellie's spot again. She had her hand on his back. Her device was in her lap, powered down for once. Marcus drove with the heat up because the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees since morning, and he'd learned that the cold settled into Ellie's joints in a way she didn't always volunteer until she was rubbing her hands against her knees, which was the tell. He saw her doing it now, in the rear view. Heat okay? She stopped, looked at the mirror, made the gesture that meant fine. He turned it up 2 degrees anyway. She didn't argue. That was progress of a kind. On Callaway Street, he pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment before turning off the engine. Same house, same porch, same light he'd started leaving on. The aluminum ramp was dusted with new snow that had come down while they were at the courthouse, and he'd need to clear it before it got icy. He got out and cleared it before he got her chair. She watched him from the backseat window while he did it. He caught her watching when he straightened up, and she didn't look away, which she'd stopped doing around week 3. Just watched him work. Done, he said, opening her door. She came out, settled in her chair, rolled up the cleared ramp. Shadow bounded past her at the door, already at the bowl before either of them were inside. Tom Vega called that afternoon. Marcus had texted him after the paperwork cleared. One line, it's done. And Tom had responded immediately with 3 words that were very Tom, which was about damn time, and then called 40 minutes later from what sounded like a parking lot. Permanent? Tom said. Permanent. A sound on the other end that wasn't quite a laugh. Man. A pause. How is she? Good. Getting better. Marcus was in the backyard, giving Ellie and Shadow some space in the house. The cold was sharp but clear, the cloud cover finally moving east, and the mountains were coming back into view above the tree line, white and enormous and indifferent in the way mountains were. How's Renee? She's asking when she can meet Ellie. Tell her whenever, no pressure. She's been reading up on communication systems, Tom said. The symbol-based one, the AAC stuff. She's got opinions. She always has opinions. Yeah, well, her opinions are usually right. A pause. Marcus, you doing okay? The question landed differently than it usually did. Tom had asked it regularly since Marcus got out. The veteran's version of a wellness check, deployed casually enough that you could deflect it if you needed to. Marcus had deflected it most of the time. Yeah, he said. And then, because it was Tom and because the day warranted it, better than I expected. That's the most honest thing you've ever told me. Don't make it weird, Tom laughed. The real one, not the courtesy version. Bring her down to Fort Collins when you're ready. We'll do dinner, nothing fancy. Renee will probably bring flashcards. I'll let her know. He ended the call and stood in the cold yard for a minute, looking at the mountains. He'd moved to Evergreen Ridge because it was quiet and small, and far enough from his last duty station that the geography felt different. He'd told himself he needed the distance. He'd told himself the solitude was recovery. He'd spent 3 years building a life that was sustainable but not full. The difference between a structure that holds and one that's worth being inside. He looked at the house. Light in the kitchen window, Shadow's shape moving past it. Somewhere inside, a girl in a sweatshirt she'd chosen herself was probably drawing, or eating something, or navigating her device, or doing any of the ordinary things she did in the hours of a day that had gradually, without ceremony, become her hours. He went back inside. Carla Reyes drove up from Denver on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the final ruling. She was 40-something, compact, moved fast, and talked faster, and she came with a binder that she set on the kitchen table and opened without preamble. Okay, she said, long-term care planning. I want to walk through what the next 2 years look like, then we'll sketch out 5 and 10. Nothing's locked. This is a working document, but you need a framework. All right. She looked at Marcus over the binder. First question. Do you know her full care team? All of them, not just Dr. Cho? Cho for PT. Dr. Sarah Mullen for primary care. I've been in contact with a speech and language pathologist in Denver about supplementing the device work. Haven't started yet, Carla wrote. Good. Gaps? Behavioral support specialist. Cho mentioned it at the last session. We haven't moved on it. I have 3 names in your area. I'll send them tonight. She turned a page. Secondary equipment. Her chair is 2 years old? 18 months. Current model, properly fitted now. You'll want to start the insurance authorization process for a replacement in about 6 months. These things take time, she wrote. Positioning supports? Updated. Physical therapist visits monthly to adjust. Communication device? Current, maintained. Carla looked up from the binder. She studied him for a moment with the assessing expression of someone who had worked with enough families to know the difference between prepared and performing. You did this before I got here, she said. Most of it. I wanted to know what questions you'd ask. She looked at him. Then at the wall with the charts and the reference guides and the therapy schedule. Then at the drawing in the frame in the living room. She could see it from where she was sitting. She draw that? Carla said. Yes. How long ago? Day 61. Day of the final ruling. Carla looked at it for another moment. Then she closed the binder partway. Mr. Hale, I work with a lot of families in complex care situations. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information, not criticism. Okay. Most families, even the good ones, hit a wall in year 2. The first year is adrenaline. The structure holds because everything is new and everyone's paying attention. Year 2 is when it starts being just life. The therapy appointments are 104th, not the 4th. The device maintenance is background, not foreground. That's when people get sloppy. That's when kids in complex care situations start slipping through gaps again. He looked at her. What's the intervention? Support. The kind you can't generate alone. She tapped the binder. Which is what this is for. You've got Vega in Fort Collins. You've got me. You need one more local family, someone with a kid in similar circumstances who gets it from the inside. I have a family in Evergreen Ridge, actually. A girl named Becca, 9 years old, similar profile. Her mom is, she checked her notes, Laura Shin. She's been looking for a peer family for Becca. Set up the meeting. Just like that? Why not? Carla looked at him again. Then she opened her binder back up. All right, she said, let's talk about the 5-year plan. Well, Ellie met Becca Shin in February. Laura Shin was a small, direct woman who drove a minivan with a lift system and arrived at Marcus's house with Becca and a container of kimchi fried rice because she believed, she told Marcus at the door, that the first meeting of any kind went better with food. He didn't argue with that. Becca was 9 and had opinions about everything and communicated in a hybrid system, some device, some ASL, some written, and she had the particular confidence of a child who had been given enough space to develop her own style. She came through the door, looked around the house, looked at Ellie, and without ceremony rolled her chair up beside Ellie's and showed her something on her own device screen. Ellie looked at it. Then she looked at Becca. Then she showed Becca something on her device. Marcus and Laura stood in the kitchen doorway watching this transaction happen, and both of them knew better than to interrupt it. She doesn't usually do that immediately, Laura said quietly. Neither does she, Marcus said. They went to the kitchen and let the girls alone in the living room. Shadow, after a thorough investigation of Becca that Becca had found extremely funny based on the sound she made, a high, open laugh that went through the house like something the walls weren't used to, settled between the 2 chairs and went to sleep. By the time the fried rice was gone, Ellie and Becca were drawing in Ellie's notebook. Together, not the same drawing, but on facing pages, comparing. Marcus watched from the kitchen for a moment. He hadn't known what he was building when he cleared out the guest room and installed the ramp and put the reference guides on the wall. He'd been doing the next necessary thing, the same way he'd always operated. Identify the requirement, resource it, execute, reassess. The methodology was the same. The mission had changed. He went back to talking to Laura Shin about behavioral support specialists, and the afternoon went on, and outside the mountains stood in their winter coats, unchanging and enormous, the town small at their feet, and in a house on Callaway Street, something that had started with a dog at a door was becoming, without announcement, a life. Spring came late to Evergreen Ridge. It always did. The elevation meant April still carried snow, and May was unreliable, and the real warm didn't settle in until June when it arrived suddenly, and the whole valley turned green in what felt like 2 weeks. By then Marcus had been Ellie's permanent guardian for 5 months. He'd stopped counting days sometime in February. Not because he'd forgotten, he didn't forget, but because it had stopped being useful. The first days you count because each one matters individually, because you're in the territory of the new and everything is its own data point. Then you stop counting because it's just the calendar now, and the calendar is just life. Ellie had therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had a video call with Laura Shin's family on alternate Saturdays that had started as a support structure and become, he was pretty sure, mostly Ellie and Becca showing each other drawings and using the device to argue about things. She had a primary care appointment every 8 weeks with Dr. Mullen, who had noted 3 times in 3 visits that she was tracking ahead of baseline on every marker. She'd started something new in March. He came home from a hardware store run. He'd been doing work on the back porch, building a proper ramp from the kitchen door into the yard, wider and better graded than the front one, and found her at the kitchen table with the spiral notebook and a different kind of pen. Not pencil. Ink. She'd been drawing in pencil since the beginning. The switch to ink meant something. He didn't know exactly what, but it meant something. He set down the hardware bag and looked at what she was doing. She was drawing the backyard. The yard he'd just been working in. The pine trees at the edge, the unfinished ramp frame, Shadow in the middle of it all, with his nose in something in the grass. She'd been watching from the kitchen window. The ink lines were different from the pencil ones. More committed. You couldn't erase ink. He went to get water from the fridge. When he came back, she'd turned the notebook toward him without being asked. He looked at it, really looked. "That's good," he said. Not the rote version he'd said in the early weeks. The actual version. That's really good, Ellie. She looked at the drawing, made the two-handed gesture he'd learned on day 7, the one that meant thank you, but also sometimes meant something closer to I know, depending on the context. He'd stopped trying to be certain which it was. Both were fine. He put the water down and sat across from her. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked up. You've been drawing for a while now. You're getting better. I want to know if you want to do something with it, classes or a program or just more materials, whatever you want. He kept it level. Not a big presentation, not a build-up, just a question. What do you think? She looked at the drawing, looked at him, reached for the pen, the ink one, and wrote something at the bottom of the page, below the drawing. She turned it toward him. Can I have better paper? He looked at it for a moment. Yeah, he said. We can get better paper. Karen Mercer's visitation petition was filed at the 90-day mark. Exactly at the mark, not a day late, which told Marcus she'd been tracking it. He'd known it was coming. He'd told Natalie weeks before that he expected it, and Natalie had said they'd handle it when it arrived, and they had. The evaluation took 3 weeks. The social worker assigned was someone Marcus hadn't worked with before, a younger woman named Priya, who was thorough and careful and clearly knew the history of the case. She interviewed Marcus, interviewed Karen separately, reviewed the full file. Marcus didn't contest the petition. He'd thought about it, turned it over in the way he turned over all the variables. Karen Mercer had written a letter that put the truth into an official record when she didn't have to. She'd filed a visitation petition at exactly 90 days, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she cared about this in a way that was distinguishable from Dale's way of caring, which had been mostly about the argument. Dale had not filed anything. Dale had gone quiet after the final ruling in the way some men go quiet. Not resolved, just out of options, and too tired to find new ones. Karen was different. He didn't tell Ellie the petition was being evaluated until Priya was 3/4 through the process. He told her one evening after dinner, plain, no editorial. Karen filed to see you sometimes, with supervision. The social worker is reviewing it. He looked at her. I want you to know it's happening, and I want you to know that whatever you want matters here. Ellie was quiet for a moment, then she reached for her device. What does she want? The voice asked. I think she wants to see you, and I think she's sorry. I can't tell you anything else for certain. Ellie looked at the device screen, then she put it down. She reached for the notebook instead, wrote something, slid it across the table. I'll try. He read it. Okay, he said. That's enough. The first supervised visitation happened on a Saturday in April at the Social Services Building, with Priya present. Marcus dropped Ellie off and drove to the coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat with a cup he didn't drink for the full hour. When he picked her up, she was quiet in the way that needed processing time, not the way that needed immediate attention. He'd learned the difference. He drove home and didn't ask. She told him that night in the notebook. She brought the notebook I left at the house, the old one, from before. He hadn't known she'd left one. He didn't ask what was in it. Good that you have it back, he said. She nodded, put the notebook away, went to bed. The visits continued, monthly, supervised, structured, slow. Marcus drove her and waited and drove her home. He didn't debrief her afterward. He was available if she wanted to talk and absent from the subject if she didn't, which was the same calibration he'd applied to everything else. It was not a neat resolution. It was not a story where the person who had failed her became someone she forgave in one clear moment and everything normalized. That wasn't how people worked. That wasn't how anything worked. What happened instead was smaller and longer and more real. A slow accumulation of Saturday afternoons, a woman trying to do something correctly that she had done incorrectly for a long time, a child deciding in increments how much space that deserved. Marcus stayed out of the deciding. In June, Tom and Renee Vega drove up from Fort Collins. Renee was exactly what Marcus had expected. Small, quick, carrying a bag full of AAC resource materials that she deployed on Ellie within 20 minutes of arrival with the cheerful precision of a person who loved her field and was extremely good at it. Ellie received this with the focused attention she gave to anything that was genuinely useful, which Marcus had come to understand was one of the most reliable things about her. Tom and Marcus sat on the back porch, the new one, wider and properly graded, and watched Shadow run the yard perimeter in the late afternoon heat, The dog's version of recreation. You look different, Tom said. Different how? Less like someone waiting for the next thing. Marcus looked at the yard. Shadow had found something in the grass along the fence line and was investigating it with forensic seriousness. I was doing that, Marcus said. For a while. Long while. Yeah. Tom looked at the open kitchen door where Renee's voice was audible, and Ellie's device, a back and forth that sounded like two people who'd found a shared language faster than expected. She good? Tom asked. Getting there. Marcus watched Shadow. It's not fast, it's not clean. She has days where the fear comes back and she doesn't know what to do with it, and I don't always know what to do with it either. He paused. But she's getting there. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, you? Marcus thought about the honest answer, the one that didn't deflect. Same, he said. Getting there. Tom nodded. Didn't make anything of it. That was the value of someone who'd known you long enough to know that getting there for Marcus Hale was not a small thing. They sat on the porch in the early summer evening while the dog ran the yard and the voices came from inside, and the mountains held their positions in the high clear blue above the tree line, the same mountains that had been there in December when the snow was coming sideways, and a child was lying on a concrete porch, and a dog had gone to a door and refused to move until someone followed him. The light stayed long in June. It came across the valley at an angle that made everything look like it was made of something warmer than it actually was. Ellie came to the kitchen door. She looked at Marcus, made the gesture, the two-handed one, and then pointed inside. He looked at Tom. Dinner. Finally, Tom said. I've been freezing out here. It's 70 degrees. I'm from Fort Collins. This is cold. Marcus got up. He went through the kitchen door past Ellie, and she followed him in, and behind them the screen door swung shut, and the yard held the long summer light a while longer before the dark came. In September, Ellie turned 8. Marcus had not thrown a birthday party in any organized sense because he'd asked her what she wanted, and she'd written just us and Becca in the notebook, so that was what he'd arranged. Becca and Laura came over. There was cake that Marcus had attempted and that Laura politely improved, and Renee Vega had driven up with Tom because Renee said September was beautiful in the mountains, and she wanted to see Ellie's new drawings. There were a lot of new drawings. She'd filled 4 notebooks since switching to ink. Marcus had also gotten her better paper, a proper sketch pad, 2 of them, and a set of drawing pens in varying weights that she'd spent 20 minutes examining in the art supply store with the same serious attention she gave everything. The pens lived in a case on her desk in the room that had stopped being called the guest room around April, quietly and without announcement. After the cake, Becca and Ellie disappeared into the room with the drawings, and were in there for a while. Marcus cleaned up the kitchen with Tom and Laura, while Renee sat at the table reading something on her phone and offering commentary on the dishes he was washing that she described as helpful and he described as unnecessary. She seems settled, Laura said. Not a question. She's getting there, Marcus said. Stop saying that, Tom said. She's there. You're both there. Just say it. Marcus looked at him. Tom handed him the serving dish to dry. You've got a problem with the finish line. Always did. You clear the objective and you're already looking for the next threat. He shrugged. This one's cleared, man. Marcus dried the dish. He looked at the kitchen wall, the charts, the reference guides, the therapy schedule. The drawing in the living room frame visible from where he stood. The drawing Ellie had made in the car on day 61. A courtroom in pencil lines. A speech bubble with 4 words. He looked at all of it. Yeah, he said. Okay. Later, after the Vegas left and Laura and Becca had driven back down the mountain, he was in the kitchen doing nothing in particular, standing with a cup of coffee at the window, the way he'd stood on the first night. And Ellie came in. She was carrying the sketch pad. She set it on the counter, open, and went to get water. He looked at the page. It was the porch. His porch. From outside. The ramp, the light, the door. Drawn in ink, careful and commit, all the lines decided. And on the porch, barely suggested, 2 figures and a dog. At the bottom of the page, in her handwriting, unsteady but clear, home. The same word she'd written the first time, but this time in ink. He stood there in this kitchen, in the quiet of a September evening, and let himself finish something he'd been in the process of finishing for a long time. Then he picked up the sketch pad and went to find a frame. The man who had spent 3 years running his brain down in the dark so he wouldn't have to feel the quiet found out. Eventually, that the quiet wasn't the problem. The problem was being in it alone. The bravest thing you can do for someone is stay. And sometimes the person who needs finding most isn't lost in the wilderness. They're on a porch, in the rain, waiting to see if anyone will look.